This could destroy our civilization and kill.
But before we get to talking about Texas, if you could explain to our audience what is the U.S. power grid, what is it made out of, a little bit of the history. So before we get into talking about Texas and the rest of the power grid, what could happen if you get a little history.
Right. Well, the electric grid, the technology that is the basis for all electronic civilization everywhere in the world, was invented here in the United States around the turn of the last century, around 1900, by a scientist named Nikola Tesla, who basically invented extra high voltage transformers, which enables us to project power from hydroelectric generation systems like at Niagara Falls. The VHV transformer will take that energy and shoot it all the way down in New York City across huge distances, where there's another big transformer at the end of the line, and then a series of transformers all the way down to your house. So the electricity, which starts off at being like 750,000 volts, gets stepped down to 120 volts, so you can use it in your house. And if you go outside of your house sometime and you look up at the telephone poles, you'll see a little black cylinder someplace in your neighborhood. That's your local, that's the last transformer. It's a small transformer that does the final stepping down of that power so that you can use it. It starts off at some big generation facility, a nuclear power plant, a big hydroelectric dam, a natural gas-fired or coal-fired generating station, where it starts off at 750,000 volts. And as I said, it goes down through a series of smaller transformers, and all of this is meticulously controlled and largely automated by control systems, which are little computers about the size of a personal computer called SCADAs, supervisory control and data acquisition systems. They regulate how that electricity flows into the transformers at every step of the way. And so you can run a whole city with just a handful of people, in terms of managing the electric grid. Relatively small numbers of people to manage the electric grid across an entire state. But if anything ever goes wrong with those SCADAs, you can have like what happened in 2003 during the Great Northeast Blackout of 2003, where a single tree branch coming in contact with a high voltage power line, a single point failure cascaded into an enormous blackout that put the whole northeastern United States and a good chunk of Canada into blackout, 50 million people into blackout for a day, including New York City. And people the subways wouldn't run. There was no running water. All the lights were out. And people had to walk from home. Now that's the kind of blackout people experience most of the time. Okay, imagine that was just a tree branch. So if you can envision something like a nuclear EMP attack or a big solar flare, a big natural EMP from the sun, that puts the whole nation, under an EMP field, which would cause millions of points of failure. All of it. Just imagine how long it would take to recover from that. We might never recover from it if it lasted a year, because as I think I might have noted, the EMP Commission calculated that if you had a year-long blackout, across the nation, we could lose 90% of our population through starvation, disease, tidal collapse. Because everything depends on electricity. When the electric grid goes, it is called the keystone critical infrastructure because it supports all the other critical infrastructures. Without electricity, there's no communications, transportation systems won't work, business and finance and industrial processes don't work. Even the military depends for all of its electricity, or virtually all of it, 99% of it, on the electric grid, which is why the bad guys think about how to attack it. Because if you can take out the national electric grid, you can win World War III very quickly without even having to fight the U.S. military, because we'd be paralyzed from the loss of that electricity. And food and water, that's the ultimate threat to our population. Even food and water depend on it. Immediately when there's a blackout, the water stops running because it requires enormous quantities of electricity to pump water, especially into the populous areas like cities, to purify wastewater so that it can be, recycled and used. And food, we only have enough food to feed 330 million Americans stored in big regional food warehouses that belong to the grocery stores. There's only enough food in those warehouses for 30 days at normal consumption rates. At your local grocery store, there's only enough food to feed people for about 3 days. And all of that food will begin to spoil as soon as the electric grid fails, because it depends on refrigeration systems, temperature control systems, the regional food warehouses. That has to be delivered every day to restock the grocery stores. Transportation doesn't work. Transportation system doesn't work. The food isn't going to be getting to the grocery stores. So that's right. the problem. That's why the casualties would be so high. The EMP Commission worked out plans on how to protect our country, spent 17 years working out plans. And in the course of developing those plans, we were never able to figure out, how do you keep 330 million Americans alive with no food and no water for a year?
Wow.
Well, you can't do it. So the only way of preserving American civilization and protecting the population is to ensure that the electric grid does not fail in the first place. It has to be designed robustly enough so that it can survive a natural EMP or a man-made EMP. A nuclear EMP attack is the worst, most stressful threat. And if you can harness the grid to say against that, and we developed plans for doing that, then you can basically survive anything, including ice storms.
Okay, I wanted to ask you, and I think that you were talking about what happened in Texas. Let's go there, because that's very current. What do you think? And you mentioned that it's like a little taste of what would happen could happen on a much larger scale and a longer time. What do you think were the reasons that brought about? Because I was watching the news and they said that 30 years ago they were supposed to fix some things in Texas and never did, and that may have been why they're in the same kind of thing again. Nobody took the advice that you need to change this, you need to improve this. It didn't happen. So do you think that's what happened, and could it happen again if they don't fix it?
That is what happened, and it will happen again, because they won't fix it. Unless government at the state level or at the federal level intervenes and makes them fix it. And that is the reason we have government. I'm not a fan of big government, but one of the reasons we have government, and the founders agreed on this, the role of government in the Constitution is to provide for the common defense. That's why we have government. That's its first role, to provide for the common defense, to protect us from foreign adversaries and to protect us from catastrophic acts of nature, so that people will live. And that's the job of government, but government isn't doing its job. And that's why that happened. I'll tell you this, I want to make sure this message gets across too.
Okay.
What is happening in Texas is not because of climate change. Okay? That's not the problem. That's not why the Texas grid has failed. It's the politics of electricity that has caused the Texas grid to fail, not climate change. This is not unprecedented. Ice storms on rare occasion like this do happen in Texas. It's not true that we are having an increasing number of hurricanes and tornadoes and other things. Every time something like this happens, it's almost like a secular religion. These people that push the climate change narrative, including the administration. Climate change is like COVID. The threat is greatly exaggerated so that government can engage in activities so that it can basically get greater control over our lives. Government is not doing the job it's supposed to be doing under the Constitution, which is protecting people from real threats. It is using the excuse of catastrophic climate change, the excuse of COVID, to get control of the economy, get control of people's lives. I mean, the things government is doing now are prohibited in the Constitution and under the Bill of Rights. There is no exception in the Constitution to say that the Bill of Rights, the right to assemble, the right to have religion, the right to earn a living and run a business, there's no exception, no clause in the Constitution that says, well, the Bill of Rights and the Constitution are suspended when you have a pandemic. You know, this has never been done before by government.
Correct.
And bipartisan failure. Okay. Now the politics. Going to what are the politics of electricity? You know, that has caused this problem. You know, the problem is that, you know, the electric grid utilities are the last critical infrastructure that still exists in a 19th century regulatory environment, which is to say they regulate themselves. They regulate themselves. That's not supposed to be the way it works. Every other critical infrastructure has a government agency that actually has significant powers to protect the public interest. Let's take as an example the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, and the airline industry, which is part of the transportation infrastructure. The FAA, you know, doesn't fool around. If there's an airplane crash, the airline industry is not allowed. They're not the ones that investigate that airplane crash to decide whether or not it was piloted or something wrong with the airplane. We don't allow them to do that because they have a financial interest, you know, in trying to deny that maybe there's something wrong with the airplane and they might have to ground the whole fleet. They'd much rather say, oh, it was pilot error. Let's keep flying this unsafe airplane. That's almost certainly going to happen when you're talking about lots of money. And so we have a Federal Aviation Administration with a lot of experts who will pull the debris from the airplane into a hangar, and they decide what went wrong. And the FAA has power to actually ground all kinds of airliners, and they recently did, you know, ground a Boeing airliner that was unsafe, even though it costs the airline industry a fortune. Those are the kinds of powers that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission should have. But they don't have those powers, and they don't want those powers. Whenever Congress tries to give them those powers, they refuse them. And why is that? Social scientists describe the phenomena as regulatory capture. It's what happens when the private sector interest that's supposed to be regulated by a federal agency manages to penetrate that agency and take it over. And so the FERC basically works for the NERC. The NERC is the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. It's the big, it's the lobby, you know, for the 3,000 electric utilities that operate in the United States. And the NERC has captured the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. All the FERC commissioners are former lawyers and lobbyists who have worked for the electric power industry. And they will go in there and do the bidding of the utilities for their tenure, and then go back to highly paid jobs in the industry. So there's a rotating door between the FERC and the NERC. And that means that, in effect, the utilities get to do whatever they want, and they regulate themselves. And that's why they literally get away with murder. And I say that not just because of what's happening in Texas, because people have died in Texas as a consequence of this ice storm, but look at California. Hundreds of people have died. They've been killed because of the failure of PG&E and the electric utilities in other electric utilities in California to engage in very basic, fundamental safety precautions to make sure that the grid doesn't fail catastrophically. You know, that it doesn't take a genius to know that when power line towers get to be 100 years old, you know, that maybe those things need to be replaced or reinforced or something. And so when the winds came along and blew these towers over, they caused huge forest fires all over California and burned the town of Paradise in California. It was completely obliterated, and hundreds of people were killed, burned to death. And the electric power industry, the utilities, they don't care about that. All they care about is not being financially responsible for it. And it's not because they're evil, okay? It's not because they're evil, but it's because that's what the private sector is supposed to do in our system. The private sector is supposed to maximize profits, and that's their job, to maximize profits. But if they're not regulated, then it becomes socially responsible. The failure is really on government to let them get away with that. The FERC, year after year, signed off on these things. They signed off on these things in California, and they signed off on these things in Texas. And let me say this about the Texas thing. Maybe I should get off my soapbox and let you ask the question. But the point you made is absolutely true. It doesn't take a genius to see that, well, someday there's going to be an ice storm in Texas that's going to be dangerous to the grid, because maybe once every 10 or 20 years, something like that does happen. How hard is it to pick up a phone and call the utility in Minnesota or New York or North Dakota, someplace where they have serious winters, okay, and say, what do you guys do to protect your grid? Because the technology is simple and it's there, and we've done it. In the northern half of the country, it does get ice storms all the time. The grid in the states that experience serious winters, severe winters, are protected the way Texas should have been protected, because they can't afford not to have them protected. Otherwise, the grid wouldn't work at all during the winter. And so they do the simple things. They insulate. There's more insulation. They have heating systems located in strategic locations so that things don't freeze up. And the grid works through serious winter weather. And there's no reason Texas couldn't and shouldn't have done that decades ago. But, because it only happens rarely, and because they could get away with it, ERCOT is the
ERCOT
lobby of utilities in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
They decided to get away with it, because of the government isn't requiring them to do it. They can increase their part. The merchant always is always concerned about his bottom line, and his planning horizon is whatever the profit sheet is going to show. Okay, whenever they have to report to their stockholders, the next meeting of the stockholders, maybe they have a planning horizon of maybe 6 months to a year. What is a year-end profits that they have made? And that's what they're concerned about. They're concerned most about their bottom line. So they're always going to prefer, when that merchant has the dollar in his hand and says, do I put this into protecting against ice storms? And it's going to lower my profits for this year if I do that, okay? Because I have to make this investment. Or do I put it in my pocket and in the pocket of my stockholders so that I'll get my salary increase, because I will have raised the profits of the company? It's obvious the choice that's going to be made. They're always going to do that. And the government is supposed to say no. They are supposed to take the 10-year view, the long view, the public safety view, and say, we're not going to let you put the lives of the people at risk. We are working for the people, and the people's interests need to be protected. Their lives need to be protected. So you are going to put that dollar into making sure that the grid doesn't fail when there's an ice storm. And that's the process that's not happening. It's not global warming. It's that's caused the Texas crisis, killed people in Texas, and has caused millions of dollars in damage to homes because of the water pipes freezing and flooding and all the other problems with the politics of electricity that is not only failing to protect the country against simple things like ice storms and severe winds in California that get people killed, but against really much more serious threats like EMP that could kill 90% of our population. And that's what's happening. That's the problem.
I was thinking about that. A what if, because you're saying the grid in Texas, because there's 3 grids, correct? Basically in the U.S.
Yeah,
Eastern, Western, and Texas.
There's the Eastern grid, which is the most important grid. The Eastern grid goes from the eastern coast of the United States to a point actually beyond the Mississippi River, to the west of the Mississippi River. And most of our population lives on the Eastern grid. And 75% of the country's electricity is generated by the Eastern grid. And if we just lost that grid, it would be over for us as a civilization, because we can't live in a nation without the Eastern grid. The bad guys would just have to take that one grid down. Then there's the Western. Yeah, the Western grid picks up where the Eastern grid leaves off, which is someplace out in the, west of the Mississippi, and then all the way to the Pacific coast. And that's the Western grid, and that supports, most of the West and the Pacific coast states and the Southwest. That's the Western grid, and the Texas grid is the third part of the North American electric grid. The Texas is the only state that has its own grid, and it's
Right.
off there on its own grid. And the Biden administration was unjust. They've been criticizing Texas for having its own grid and not being tied into the other grids. That's actually good for Texas, because that means that they don't have to. The California grid, as we know, has been having all these problems that I've described.
Correct.
And so the Texas grid has managed to isolate itself. If they were tied into the Western grid, they would have to carry the dead weight of California, and they don't want that. Also,
Right.
they have to carry. They have to put up. Texas is in kind of a unique position because they're potentially isolated from the politics of Washington, which heavily favor the electric power utilities. They heavily favor the NERC, as I mentioned to you. So Texas has a fighting chance, because they own their own grid. They have their own grid owned by the utilities in Texas, but they've got a fighting chance to be able to protect Texas before the rest of the country gets protected. Governor Abbott is a smart guy. They have a senator down there, Senator Bob Hall. He's a Texas state senator who happens to be an EMP expert himself. Before he became a Texas state senator, he was Colonel Bob Hall, and U.S. Air Force colonel who participated in the Minuteman III ICBM program to protect the Minuteman ICBM from nuclear EMP attack. So he knew about EMP when he came in, and I've worked with him to try for several years to get a bill passed. And we've come very close on a number of occasions to getting a bill passed in Texas, but we always get stopped because NERC and the Electric Power Research Institute and the Edison Electric Institute and these other lobbies that are not ashamed. They will lie, and they do lie, and will put out disinformation. One of the things they always do to try to defeat Senator Hall's bills or delay the bills is say, well, if you do this protection, it's going to drive up everybody's electrical costs, and it's not going to be affordable. It's not going to be politically popular to have to increase people's electrical bills. And that is a lie, because it won't dramatically increase people's bills. The utilities do all kinds of things that cost a lot more, but don't really add anything to security. And when you want to talk about the cost, it is far more costly to be unprotected, because people's lives are worth more than money. But if you don't care about people's lives, and you're even willing to sacrifice people's lives, and you're strictly talking about dollars and cents, as a consequence of their failure to protect the Texas grid from this ice storm, the cost of electricity in Texas has skyrocketed, from $40 a megawatt hour to $9,000 a megawatt hour. And there are some people who are being threatened. Average people in Texas are being threatened with bankruptcy, because they're getting electric bills. They're in danger of getting electric bills unless the governor stops it, and he should. They want to. The utilities on their ERCOT wants to charge people like $100,000 for keeping the lights on over this past weekend. Because of the incredible cost of electricity. Because they failed to protect the electric grid, and that's their plan. You see, that's what the utilities are doing. They want to pass the costs and the risks on to the consumer, so they don't have to pay for them. They tried to get away with this in California by declaring bankruptcy, when they were sued for killing all those people. Fortunately, the California Supreme Court, turned them down and said, no, you're not going to be able to declare bankruptcy. But they're not done. They're going to go try to bring it all the way up, probably to the Supreme Court, to try to evade having to pay for their reckless irresponsibility. So that's the situation. That's what we're dealing with. And again, I blame government more than I blame the utilities. The utilities are just doing what all private sector, we should have learned. We should have learned from history, that's when government fails to do its job, the private sector will behave irresponsibly, and they will do they will not hesitate to exploit the public, in order to make money. There was a time before we had a pure Food and Drug Administration, for example, during the early progressive era, when Coca-Cola, the reason Coca-Cola has the name, it used to be called Cocaine Cola, because there was cocaine in Coca-Cola, and they were deliberately getting people hooked on cocaine that way so that they would increase the sales of Coca-Cola soda. And, but the Pure Food and Drug Administration came along. People would find mice in a can of peaches, when before there was regulation. That's why we have a Pure Food and Drug Administration, to make sure bad things like that don't happen. But we basically, and so that's what it means when I say, that the electric utility industry, operates in a 19th century regulatory environment. It means they're not regulated. They regulate themselves. And as long as that situation continues, this problem is not going to get fixed. And it puts all of our lives at risk. And the bad guys are watching. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. What do you think they think when they see that even an ice storm can cause this kind of a problem that increases their confidence that they can pull off this new way of warfare and hit us? Sabotage, cyber attacks, EMP attacks, and take us down.
That was it. Well, that was my next question. I was about to ask you. All that you've mentioned regarding the power grid and the inability of people trying to fix the issue and just like kicking the can down the road. You don't have to worry about it now. It's a one-time thing. There are nations who are watching. You mentioned China, Russia, Iran, who are saying, wow, it won't take much. The grid is not that big. All we have to do is do a cyber attack, disconnect the grid. And you told me, you just said, all they need to do is really disconnect the eastern grid. Is that correct? If a nation like China or Russia or Iran would disconnect the eastern grid, that would be the end. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. That would be ended for us for civilization. But they would go after all three grids because they want one of their chief goals in attacking the grid is to paralyze our military forces so that we couldn't respond to fight a war with them militarily. Now, most of our military bases are located in the eastern grid too, but we have some important military bases out west, some of the most important, like NORAD headquarters located out west. Most of the Minuteman ICBM wings are located in western states. So those are high priority targets for them. And Texas has got a lot of military bases they're going to want to take out. They would almost certainly attack all three grids. Although I can envision scenarios, and in the EMP Commission we looked at different scenarios. I can envision scenarios where they might want to just attack one grid, like Texas. I could envision a scenario, for example, where North Korea, might be suffering from instability or feel itself very much at risk from economic sanctions, and fight in effect fire a shot across our bow and say, if you attack us or if you continue these sanctions that are so destructive to our population, we're gonna demonstrate what we can do by taking out the Texas grid, and if you persist, we're gonna take out all three grids. So I could see where a limited attack might be done on a state like Texas, just to demonstrate our vulnerability and to send a warning to us, to back off in some parts. Whether it's I also think and they actually the game plan is described, right in their military doctrine, and they exercise it. While they could take out the grid in any number of ways, the most effective way is the EMP attack, the nuclear EMP attack. That's you could take out the grid practically at the speed of light, across an EMP field single weapon. And North Korea has got 2 satellites that are already in over us that might be nuclear armed. We don't know for sure they are, but the EMP Commission in its reports warned that those 2 satellites could be armed with super EMP weapons, so that North Korea, when it's ready to do it, could basically take out all of North America, not just the 48 states, but Canada, the 48 states, and a good chunk of Mexico. The EMP field would cover all that area and destroy electronics across that whole area. Not just the grid, but cars would stop, airplanes would fall out of the sky, all kinds of electronics. This computer I'm talking to you over would be fried in an attack like that. That's one. They could do it just by cyber. They could do it just by sending in special forces teams. If you shoot up enough of these big transformers, a small number of people, surprisingly small number of people, could take out the whole national grid, for more than a year, just by shooting up enough of those transformers. And but in their planning, they plan to do everything, and that makes sense, because if you want to win World War III, you're going to throw in the kitchen sink. And we have seen the Russians exercise this at least twice. Before their Vostok 18, they had probably the biggest military exercise in world history, called Vostok 18. They did it in September of 2018. And it was really an almost full dress rehearsal, I think, for World War III.
Invasion.
Yeah, they mobilized 300,000 troops, 36,000 tanks and other armored vehicles, 1,000 aircraft. They mobilized their navy, and China joined them in a simulated nuclear war against the United States. But before they launched Vostok 18, that was the visible exercise that they wanted us to see. But just before they did that, there was this mysterious incident where the Russians penetrated hundreds of U.S. utilities with cyber bugs. And I think what they were doing was they were practicing the new way of warfare. That before you actually do the traditional war, see if you can win just by taking out the electric grid, by this combined arms operation. It's like a blitzkrieg in cyberspace or in the electromagnetic spectrum that combines cyber attack, physical sabotage, non-nuclear EMP weapons, and ultimately a nuclear EMP weapon. All these things together. Any one of them could take out the grid, but when you combine them, the synergistic effects are irresistible. Sort of the way the original Nazi blitzkrieg was irresistible. You could win a war just with having better armor. You could win a war just by having better aircraft. You could win a war just by having better infantry, mobile infantry, who are moved around the battlefield in trucks and armored fighting vehicles. But imagine the effect if you combine all 3 of those together. The effect is irresistible. The original blitzkrieg, they came very close to conquering the world. They overran Europe. Overran France in less than a month. But so that's the foreign threat, and they certainly are noticing what's happening in Texas. And by the way, let's not forget, everybody has such a short memory. Just in December, we faced the solar attack, which is the largest cyber attack ever made. It's a cyber attack that we think came from Russia. The most ambitious, furthest reaching cyber attack, and that attack has coincided with another strategic forces exercise that was personally run by Putin, where they simulated nuclear war against the United States, including live launching of several ICBMs and strategic bombers and cruise missiles. But Washington doesn't connect the dots, and they quickly forget about these things. So they just practiced this in December, okay? And now, our vulnerability is once more demonstrated by Mother Nature, by this ice storm. And in between these 2 things, in the first week after President Biden became president, one of his first acts was to cancel an executive order by the previous administration that was designed to protect the American grid from importations of Chinese equipment into the electric grid.
Yep.
You have something like 300 big transformers that have been made in China, and we have hundreds of control systems throughout our grid that were made in China. And people are concerned that the Chinese have built backdoors into these systems so that they are more vulnerable to cyber attack, and they may be designed to be deliberately more vulnerable to EMP, so that if a war comes, they can more easily just turn these things off and start these cascading failures that I've been describing. Now, it makes no sense that in the aftermath of the solar winds hack and this big nuclear forces exercise, okay, that the first thing the president does is make us more vulnerable by canceling that executive order. I mean, that's sending the wrong message to the bad guys, and it's the wrong thing to do. I hope they reverse their decision on that. They haven't canceled it, or they've suspended it for 90 days to examine it. But the idea is it's what they call a balloon in Washington. You know, can they get away with canceling the executive order? And I hope that maybe they will learn a lesson from the Texas, grid crisis, to say, well, we'd better do more to protect our grid, and maybe it's not a smart idea to be installing Chinese equipment in our grid.
I think you absolutely heard that one of his executive orders was to rescind what regarding these transformers coming from China. It's kind of a crazy idea. The idea that we are buying transformers from a nation that, if given the opportunity, would disconnect our electricity. Who brag about taking over the country? It doesn't make any sense to me. As you said, why would we want any transformers anyway? It just doesn't make any sense.
It makes no more sense than it would to have the Chinese be making our aircraft carriers or our other aircraft for us. Trust them to do the job correctly. It just makes no sense. And especially right now, because we're in the middle of a serious international crisis with China over the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits. The dictatorship, I'm not going to call him president, but dictatorship in China.
Yes, that's what I call it.
Military forces to be ready for a world war with the United States at any moment. We're so wrapped up in our domestic affairs, that people are forgetting about these crises that are going on overseas that are very serious. We've got another short term. It's not as serious as the crisis with China is right now, but we recently had an exercise where, for the first time, we flew strategic bombers into the Nordic countries, landed them there to try to deter. Russia claims the Arctic Ocean and all the resources of the Arctic seabed, and our allies, our Nordic allies, disagree with that. That Russia is basically claiming territory that belongs to them, and so we decided to show the flag, just the way we show the flag in the South China Sea, to try to get the Russians to back off a little and to deter them. But that never seems to work. And instead, it just escalates more nuclear saber rattling from them. So these are really dangerous things that are happening around the world. And we also have issues with North Korea. Iran is, looks like it's, on the verge. I think they've already got nuclear weapons, but they're sort of coming out of the closet on their nuclear program and threatening to go overtly nuclear. These things are very alarming. And on another topic I'd like to add, sort of before I forget it, but people just don't seem to be capable of connecting the dots. But there's another development that's going on. We just don't think through, it seems, the consequences of actions that increase our civilizational vulnerability. Okay, and now we have this example of the vulnerability of the electric grid right in front of our eyes, because of Texas, right?
Correct.
At the same time that this is happening, We have the Bitcoin phenomenon, where the super rich are thinking of the Bitcoin as a possible way of replacing the current cash money economy, okay, and going to Bitcoin, which is a cyber currency. Yes. And Bitcoins have skyrocketed in value because the super rich are buying them up. They think of it as like having the same value as gold. I think a Bitcoin costs $50,000, one Bitcoin now, okay? And but Bitcoins are absolutely worthless if there's no electricity. So these super rich guys, who are very influential politically, I hope they think about that. Maybe they don't care about the lives of 330 million Americans. But surely they care about their money. So I hope that they will. I'm writing an article about this now, and I'm hoping that they can be persuaded to use their vast political influence to protect their money by protecting the electric grid, persuading the right policies to be implemented to protect their electric grid. And then as an incidental consequence of that, 330 million American lives will be safer because because the super rich, will want to protect their Bitcoins. This Bitcoin phenomenon reminds me of if they fail to protect the electric grid, we could have a replay of the tulip mania that occurred 400 years ago. In the early 1600s, Holland was a great power. We don't think of the Netherlands and Holland as being a great power today, but they had a mighty navy, they were a world empire. They were one of the wealthiest countries in the world. In fact, the per capita income in Holland in the early 1600s was the highest anywhere in the world. And they had very advanced financial banking system and a stock market. They had the stock market system. They almost invented it. And the tulip, the flower, was new to Europe. It had been imported from the Ottoman Empire. And there was a craze about tulips. And the tulip bulb, became a commodity like the Bitcoin on the Dutch stock market. And people were doing paper trading, and the value of a tulip bulb became equivalent to 50,000 golden guilders, which is more than a highly skilled craftsman could earn in 10 years, one tulip bulb. And so people were investing in tulip bulbs, which obviously have no inherent value, just the way a Bitcoin has no inherent value, right? Right. And then one day when it came time when they actually had a tulip bulb auction in Haarlem, the financial capital of Holland, and the rubber hit the road, and people wanted to translate their paper possession of tulip bulbs into actual golden guilders. Nobody was willing to spend golden guilders, give up golden guilders to buy tulip bulbs. Everybody was hoping to get the golden guilders. They were investing in tulip bulbs because they believed, that they were going to become rich overnight in that way. And the Bitcoin phenomena could be exactly that same kind of a thing. I mean, overnight, the tulip bulb lost 99.999% of its value and basically became worthless. And the same thing could happen to Bitcoins in fact, it would be worse. There was a director, I don't remember the gentleman's name, but he was the director of the Dutch Central Bank. And he said of the Bitcoins that it would be worse than the tulip crisis, because at least in the tulip crisis, when the bottom fell out of the market, you still had a tulip bulb, whereas with Bitcoins, you would end up with nothing in your hand. So, hopefully, I hope the so-called smart rich guys, these multi-billionaires who are buying up all these Bitcoins, I hope they pay attention to what's happening in Texas. I hope they realize that.
Well, before because this has been a lot of information, and I know we spent quite a few time, I want to ask you before we finish tonight, could you mention the nations and they're watching us due to the inability to fix the issue, and we're not fixing the problem. If and you mentioned some scenarios. If a scenario like that would happen, this what comes to my mind. Is there a backup? Let's say for the military, is there such a thing as it? Because I saw in a video where there's an airplane up after an EMP and it flies after an EMP. It's anti-EMP. It can survive and it can see what's happening. It's the only form of communication that exists. It can the military, the U.S. military, be able to react as if the let's say these foreign nations plan an invasion after some sort of EMP? Would they be prepared? That's what I want to know.
Well, the military is the best prepared part of our whole society because
Okay.
there is a thin line of strategic command and control and forces that's supposed to be protected against EMP.
Okay.
The tactical aircraft, for example,
Right.
which is the communications aircraft. Some people call it the doomsday aircraft. It's supposed to be able to survive so that it could issue emergency action messages, launch missiles, bombers, and have submarines launch. If that thing didn't survive, nobody would be able to get orders from the president to execute their forces. Air Force One is EMP hardened. All the Air Force helicopters are EMP hardened.
Okay.
All the bombers and all the strategic bombers that are supposed to have a nuclear mission, okay? But this is only in like 5% of our military forces that are supposed to survive in a threat environment.
Mm-hmm.
They're supposed to be hardened against EMP. And they were hardened against EMP, but only to Cold War standards. All the hardening was done during the Cold War standards, which is 50,000 volts per meter. All right, that's before we knew about the existence of super EMP weapons, which can generate 100,000 volts per meter or more.
100.
They have not been hardened to that standard, and so theoretically, with a single super EMP weapon, you could try everything, even the stuff that we hardened during the Cold War. One of the recommendations of the EMP Commission was that we need to increase the EMP hardening, even of that thin line of military forces, to make sure that they would survive. As for the general purpose forces that you would rely upon to repel an invasion or something like that, almost none of that is hardened. They're basically very vulnerable. Tanks and trucks and the communications equipment is almost all of it is not hardened against an EMP.
Wow. So they wouldn't. So if that would happen, there's certain military equipment that can be used, and others will be out. Correct?
Well, we hope there is some military equipment that we have hardened to Cold War standards, and maybe it would work. Okay, but I doubt it. I mean, conservative military planners are supposed to assume you hope for the best, but plan for the worst. And we're not planning for the worst right now. The worst is a super EMP weapon that can generate 100,000 volts per meter and maybe more. And we're not planning for that. We are not prepared for that. We don't even have a simulator in the United States that goes up to 100,000 volts per meter that can expose a whole aircraft body to that much. Everything is geared to 50,000 volts per meter. And this is something else that really needs to be done. The EMP executive order that was signed by the White House in 2019, requires the Department of Defense to act on that, to work on that. And I am glad to say, I am pleased that so far, I'm told that the White House plans to continue with that EMP executive order and to continue implementing it. And so that's a very good thing. And I'm glad to see that there is somebody, who is thinking about these things in the new administration. So I hope they don't cancel that other executive order that I talked about.
Right.
Right. But at least on this one, and there has long been bipartisan support for protection against EMP. It's not just a Republican issue. I mean, every Congress and every president, both Democrat and Republican, since 1963, has invested billions of dollars in trying to protect, the nuclear retaliatory deterrent from EMP. And now I think we've spent the last 17 years, the EMP Commission, making the case that we also need to protect our civilian population. You know, we need to protect the electric grid and the other life-sustaining critical infrastructures so that the American people can survive. Because we have to worry about more than man-made EMP. You know, there's no deterring the sun. You know, the sun can produce a natural EMP that can affect electric grids and critical infrastructures all over the world. And that will happen for sure someday. And I think that NASA estimates it's 12% per decade. You know, and I think the American people, they don't want to just be avenged. They want to survive. They want to live. Okay, and that's the duty of government. One could even argue that this theory of mutual assured destruction, which we've been banking on all through the Cold War, is unconstitutional. You know, is that providing for the common defense that we have a nuclear Mexican standoff, so that our defense, if they attack us and destroy us, well, then we attack and destroy them too. Is that providing for the common defense, really?
No.
You know, I don't think so. I think the understanding of the founders, when they said that, is that means that you provide to protect and survive, you know, a war, that the people's lives are supposed to be protected. That's what defense is. The common defense is the common defense. It also means that you know, by the common defense is that the people are protected, not just, you know, the president and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and members of Congress and the Internal Revenue Service. You know, the Washington elites are not the only ones who are supposed to survive. You know, in fact,
everybody.
The first customer is the taxpayer and the average American.
The taxpayer, correct. One last question I want to ask you before we go tonight, and I'm so glad you've been with us. You said a lot of great information for people to think about. And if you were going to give, because you've been doing this for the last 17 years, trying people see if people got something to make changes and prepare. If you were going to grade what the preparation of America, of the U.S., for any upcoming, any kind of EMP, whether it's non-nuclear, nuclear, or for our power grid being prepared for any of that coming, what kind of grade would you, after 17 years, would you give the U.S.?
Well, you know, I guess it's hard to just give a single grade for the whole society, because there's a real asymmetry here. The military has taken the EMP threat seriously, and part of the military deserves a C. You know, at this juncture, I would have given them a B or maybe even an A- during the Cold War, but today it's hard to give them more than a C. You know, because of the super EMP weapons that they haven't responded to. If the super EMP weapon threat had been understood in the Cold War, our military would be doing everything possible to address that. You know, but they're not doing that. As to protecting our civilian infrastructures, all the rest of the U.S. government, I'm tempted to give them an F, okay, but I'll give them an E, because we've won all the political struggles. You know, we have a presidential EMP executive order. That's a really big deal. The Congress of the United States, on a bipartisan basis, has joined. It's the only time in history that the Congress said, not only do we agree with this EMP executive order, but in the National Defense Authorization Act, we're codifying that executive order in the law, so that we, the Congress of the United States, is telling you, U.S. government, that we agree with the president. And not only that, not only do you need to obey the commander-in-chief, but if you don't, you're going to be breaking the law. Okay? But despite all of that, you know, we've arrived at this system where a situation in this country that the founders, maybe they did anticipate it, but checks and balances haven't worked. We've got this big leviathan called the administrative state. And they think, you know, they think they can just ignore presidents And they think they can ignore the Congress even. And they do manage to do it because they never get fired and they do what they want. And oftentimes what they do, especially when it comes to the electric grid, they do what the utilities want, which is nothing. They come up with excuses. This executive order, I mean, it's been 2 years since that executive order was signed, and not a single part of the electric grid is actually protected. But the bureaucracy will tell you they're making big progress, because in Washington, having meetings and writing another study and hiring a defense contractor to write another expensive study, this is considered progress in Washington.
Right.
Whereas the average American outside the Beltway, progress is, did you put a surge arrestor on that transformer? Are the skates inside of Faraday cages? How many of the transformers have you protected so far? They haven't protected any of them, and so that's no progress. But we have at least won all the policy arguments, and we beat them in the law, in the Congress, we beat them in the White House, and the bureaucracy at least has to pay lip service, to the fact that the nation should be protected. So that's why I give the system an E and not an F.
You give him a what? A D?
If you grade A, B, C, D, E, F, okay.
Oh, you give him an E.
F is the worst. An E is a little bit above the worst. So I give him an E. It's a failing grade. It's still a failing grade.
Well, I mean, from what you just said, for any American who's watching this program or watching Are You Ready? I mean, it sounds to me that the American people need to be prepared at home for this, because from what you're telling me, it isn't ready for any kind of attack of any kind, because if you give them that low grade. So I really believe that every individual, every home, every person's a family, whatever, you need to be prepared at home. You need to have imagine enough water, enough non-perishable foods, because people are thinking, in my opinion, everybody believes when they click up the lights are always going to be there. They're always going to have their cell phone. They're always going to have everything. But from what you're telling me, it's not always going to be there, and they're not really prepared. So I think every individual needs to make their own preparations. Correct?
Yes, and you don't need me to tell you this.
Right.
Every intelligent American knows this right now because of what's happening in Texas. What kind of grade would anyone or you give them, given what you can see happening with your own eyes in Texas, and what happened after Katrina, and what happened after Hurricane Sandy, over and over again, and they never seem to learn, do they? The utilities actually give themselves big points and think they're doing a great job. It's unbelievable. The power of denial and self-deception and self-justification is almost an infinite resource, when money is involved. If you can put more money in your pocket, even if it costs other people their lives, it seems people are capable, the utilities certainly are capable of rationalizing anything, no matter how reckless and dangerous the behavior is.
Yeah, and I hope people listen to what Dr. Pry has said, waking you up. And I really believe you need to pray that God gives you wisdom, and prepare at home. Don't take everything for granted that everything will be there. You need to be prepared. You need to be prepared at home. I'm so glad you've been with us, Dr. Pry. And what would you say to those who are watching? And I asked you that the last time. What would you, after all you said, what would you want to tell the American people, those who are watching Are You Ready? What would be your advice to them?
Well, first, I agree with you that individuals should prepare. And it was part of American exceptionalism all through our history to be prepared until about a generation ago. You know, the Great Generation, my father's generation, the generation that lived through the Great Depression and World War II. That generation, they believed in preparedness. They didn't trust the government. They'd seen the government fail in War and Peace. They'd lived through the Great Depression. My father had to feed his family by hunting woodchucks. They'd heat the home. They would walk along the railroad tracks to pick up coal that had fallen off of railroad cars. And then they'd seen the government fail catastrophically in the economy. And then in World War II, we almost lost World War II. And the truth is, World War II wasn't chiefly won by Franklin Roosevelt and General Patton. The World War II was won by guys like my father, who were sergeants in the army, who had to go face to face with Nazi Germany and keep them on the battlefield, even though we had inferior weapons. German tanks. It cost us. We would lose 5 Sherman tanks against a single Tiger tank, because our military screwed up and we weren't prepared to fight the Blitzkrieg. And it was up to guys. The average American won World War II more than all the generals and the politicians. And so they didn't trust the government for good reason. And afterwards, in the Cold War, they didn't know what could happen. There could be a nuclear war. There could be another economic depression. But both my parents, we lived on a third of an acre, and we had fruit trees. My mother had a big garden. She was always canning things. We had enough food for more than a year. My father taught us to hunt and fish, not just for recreation, because that's how he fed his family. And there was a pride in that. They didn't live frightened lives. When you can take care of yourselves and your family, it actually makes for a happy existence because you don't have to depend on anyone. And they didn't want to take handouts from the government. That would be compromising their freedom. They understood that. And the founders who established this country and our Constitution was made and crafted for that personality type. People who were rugged individualists and self-reliant and didn't trust the government and didn't want the government telling them what to do and taking care of them. They wanted to take care of themselves because that's what maximizes freedom. And that makes for a happier life. And so that's one part of the message I would give the American people. Do be prepared. Have food and water, so that you can survive through a crisis. Stockpile it. Have a medicine kit and know how to use it. Think about where you live. Is it going to be safe? Do you have a friend that lives in the country, or do you own a country house where you can go if things really go bad? But beyond that, and even more important than that personal preparedness, don't go turtle. Don't withdraw. Too many preppers and survivalists give up on the political system. They get so discouraged. Think about it is going to cost you a lot of time and some money to be prepared. But it doesn't cost you. It costs you very little to make a phone call, to send an email. You own this government. You're supposed to own this government. This government is supposed to work for you. All levels of government are supposed to work for you. You're the taxpayer, local, state, and federal. Get on. You're the boss. Act like the boss. Get on their case. Order them to protect the electric grid. Talk to the local people. Who the mayor of your town, the governor of your state legislature, your congressmen and senators, and keep making noise. They're already on your side, actually. But it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. Keep reminding them. Say, hey, I don't want to have happen in my state what happened in Texas. You find a way to get the utilities to do the right thing and protect it. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Yes. The ideal outcome is that you will never have to eat any of that food that you've stockpiled. You will never have to use that medicine kit. You'll be able to go to a doctor, okay? And, you're the boss. Get the government to do its job.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Pry, I want to say thank you. Thank you so much for being here on Are You Ready? Thank you for taking the time and sharing all that you shared to the people. And I wish you the best for you and your family. Loves you. And thank you for being with us here, okay? And I hope you continue to speak out and more opportunities to tell people what they need to do and what's happening. Well, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I greatly
Thank you.
appreciate
You
it.
have a nice evening, sir. Thank you very much.
Okay.
All right, everybody. If you're watching, thank you for joining us here on Are You Ready? Please subscribe, thumbs up if you like the video, and please share this video. This is very important for a lot of people to listen. Thank you, and have a very nice evening, everybody. Good night.